on to Australia Day, and the IPA, you guys regularly poll support for Australia Day. This year there has been a notable shift. But even some of the politicians are starting to change their narrative. What have you picked up?
Well, it's been a massive year. We've been doing this survey for about 7 years now, tracking the attitudes of Australians toward Australia Day, and this is the single biggest increase we've ever seen, from 63 to 69%. Who support 26 January as Australia Day. And that was driven by young Australians, the youngest cohort, 18 to 24-year-olds, increasing from 42 to 52%. And the debate has completely changed. You know, we had record turnouts to Australia Day events across our nation, whether they were official events held by councils at local parks and community centres, or whether it was Australians going to the beach or other community areas to celebrate our National Day, at the same time as we had a record drop in those who were attending protests and so-called Invasion Day, rallies. So what we've seen is an enormous vibe shift over our National Day. Australians, the silent majority is no longer silent, and it's a beautiful thing to see because, I think we were at risk at one point of losing our National Day, but it's certainly come roaring back, and I don't think there's any turning back now.
No, I don't think there is. And I think, particularly when the going gets tough, people do still realise how lucky we are to live in this country. Now, this week, Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, they're in Poland for the 80th anniversary commemorations of the liberation of Auschwitz. The Prime Minister has stood by his decision to send Wong, but he does seem a little rattled by the backlash. What are your thoughts on this decision and how it's been handled?
Well, he probably didn't have any choice but to send Senator Wong, given her position as Foreign Affairs Minister. I think it'd be odd to send anyone of a lower, position within Cabinet. So he probably had to go with her. This goes to the problem. I mean, this is such a solemn anniversary, such a serious one, not only for the Jewish people, but for all of humankind in terms of what was experienced at Auschwitz and all throughout World War II. So it's important that humanity remembers what happened and what other people are capable and are still capable of. Just because it happened in the past doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. So we need to remember that, and that's the whole point of remembrance. I think the issue here is the government lacks credibility because they really have lacked leadership on the domestic level since the October 7 attacks, where they've always been on the back foot. They've been reluctant. It seems like they've often been dragged kicking and screaming to make a statement and try to stamp out some of the behaviour. And like I've said before, it has given a bit of a permission structure for domestic behaviour that we've seen from protesters and agitators to continue. So, the real problem is because they lack leadership on the domestic front, they've lacked credibility on the international stage, and that's exactly what we're seeing now.
And on the issue of domestic leadership, in an interview with Andrew Clennell on this channel yesterday, Albanese stood by his decision to purchase a $4.2 million holiday home while maintaining that no one will be left behind. Now, I'm not quite sure that hit the chord with Australians that he thinks it might. Is this just more poor judgment from the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think everyone says, you have every right to buy a holiday home, whether you're a politician or not, and I don't have any problems with that. But it's incongruent with his political history and how he presents himself to the community as someone from a working class battling background in a housing trust, and I don't doubt the way he's presented himself. But what I do doubt is whether he's authentic to that now, and decisions he's taken, including in relation to his massive defined benefits that he'll receive when he does leave Parliament, and the holiday home purchase, as I say, incongruent with how he's presented himself. So, it's all about, what kind of story are you telling the community, and how does your behaviour and actions then shape up to that? Because people will judge you based upon what you have said and who you have said you are. And so this purchase is clearly inconsistent with the person who he has said he is. It's also taking in place in the context of a housing shortage driven by this government's mass migration program. They brought in over 1 million migrants on a net basis, which has driven Australians out of the housing market and really caused the rents to skyrocket, as you would know full well in Perth. They've been dramatically increasing as they have across the country. So, not only is there an incongruency, but there's also people look at it and say, well, your own policy is causing problems for everyday Australians.
And it is causing problems for everyday Australians, Dan. We do have an election coming up. The Prime Minister can say what he likes, but are Australians listening?
Well, they're probably starting to tune out. And I think this sort of happened with the Voice to Parliament, which was an inflection point where, you spent $500 million on a referendum to divide Australians by race, which was sort of driven by the activist class. And Australians had a lot of goodwill towards that. And I think they also had a lot of goodwill towards this government. Albanese was very popular to start with for a number of months. And of course, Scott Morrison, his predecessor, was very unpopular. So Australians were willing and open to a change after a decade of coalition government that often failed to deliver for people and was a massive failure during COVID, both at the federal and state, although it was Labor at state level, but Liberal oppositions didn't hold state governments to account. So Australians were rightly saying, well, let's give something else a go. But I think ever since the Voice to Parliament, when they heard from Albanese for a year and a half talking about, well, we need to have this policy to entrench racial division, while Australians were struggling with cost of living and were more concerned with other issues. So, again, he sort of bought himself a bit of time with the Stage 3 tax cut revamp. That sort of saved him with the by-election in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. But, it's really a question of, well, can he pull a rabbit out of the hat again? And I think the latest news poll would suggest that he's really struggling on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, just on the Invasion Day protests you alluded to a little bit earlier, they have become a recent pox on Australia Day. As you said, numbers appear to have dropped off in Sydney while those Invasion Day protests joined forces with the pro-Palestine protests in Melbourne. I'm not quite sure the black armband view of the world is as popular as it once was, and I'm not quite sure if the recent US election has had any impact on that. What's your view?
Oh, I think the US election has had a massive impact. I mean, whatever happens to the US reverberates around the world, especially in the Western world, whether, you agree with it or not. And I think Trump has taken a cudgel to wokeism. And like I said before with the Voice to Parliament, let's not forget about that as well. I mean, that was really the first major defeat of identity politics with a national vote in the Western world, other than perhaps Brexit, although there was a big economic dimension to Brexit that wasn't there with the Voice as much. So, there's a big component there. With the protest, I mean, it's your typical renter crowd, isn't it? It's as you said, not only the Indigenous activists, but the Palestine activists and anybody else in between. So I don't think there's any grassroots support for this at all. As far as I could see, mainstream Australians were just having a good time with their families, whether it was, at one of the local events for breakfast or lunch or at the beach in the hotter parts of the country. So, yeah, I think these protests are well and truly very much a fringe component now of our society, and so much the better, I reckon.
And over the weekend, Peter Dutton handed down his refreshed shadow ministry, and crowd favourite Jacinta Price, she's been given the newly created role of government efficiency spokesperson. I mean, look, we're small government people, so we're probably a bit biased, but do you think this was a good move?
It's a very good move. Jacinta showed that she's not only a community leader, but also a national leader with the Voice to Parliament debate. And, she was going to lead that debate no matter what, whether the Liberals were yes or no or in between. She was always going to lead the no campaign one way or the other. And, I think Jacinta has demonstrated time again that she really can talk to mainstream Australians. I reckon that the speech that she gave at the National Press Club during the Voice to Parliament debate, which kind of went under the radar a little bit, but I think it's one of the most significant and important speeches delivered by a political leader in recent memory, and I'd encourage everybody to revisit that. And certainly her elevation to a critical nationwide role and an economic role of government efficiency will give her, I think, a broader set of responsibilities, and I've got no doubt that she's going to play a very key role in the campaign. And if the coalition do form government, look, there's a lot of red tape that needs to be cut. So it's a big job that she'll have ahead of her.
Speaking of red tape, and on to our friends at the ABC, well, they haven't bothered to send anyone to Auschwitz to cover the Holocaust memorial commemoration. We note, of course, that they sent 37 staff at a cost to the taxpayer of $150,000 for the 4-day Garma Festival. The collective appears to still be running the show, Dan.
Yeah, it does. And this is a big issue for the ABC and for all Australians, because all Australians pay for the ABC, or at least all Australian taxpayers pay for the ABC. And, over the years, really over, I'd say, the last decade or so, the ABC has stopped being an institution of cultural importance in a manner that it may have been in the past. It struggles to speak to mainstream values because it is largely captured by an inner city collective run out of Sydney and Melbourne. I've been on the ABC many times in the regions, and I reckon they do a pretty good job on regional radio. They're fairly balanced. But when it comes to representing mainstream Australians in the suburbs and the outer suburbs, they time and time again show that they get it wrong. They're just so focused on their niche issues that they just can't. They're in a position now where I reckon they just can't even understand what the typical person on the street thinks. So this is why their ratings of their marquee programs are going down, and look, they're just going to continue to go down if they behave in this manner.
It won't surprise you that I am in furious agreement. Thank you so much, Daniel Wild.